inspires me is having been born in Mississippi in 1943 and watching as I grew up, watching the treatment of my family, treatment especially of my father. My father was this big, tall man, who just was treated so awful in so many places. And so as his daughter, as I watched this, one experience in particular was I watched as he was spit on by this white man who he worked for. And I watched my father. I remember watching my father because the man, even at that young age, understood that the rage and hate that would have had to be inside of him to make him do this to someone like my father. Even at that age, I could understand that. What I couldn't understand was that my father stood taller and took his huge protective hand, put it on my head as I was this little girl, and we walked. It's kind of like when you hold someone's hand.
Right.
Well, he put his hand on top of my head and turned me, and we walked away. And he never said a word, but the energy that he really transmitted to me from that experience has left me with a better, greater, deeper commitment to mastery of myself. So I wanted to understand how the inside, how his inside, how the mechanisms for coping gave him that strength, exactly. So what I tried to do in creating the Cultural Wellness Center was create an alternative, which meant we had to deal with transformation and becoming. How do you change?
Move from one. Yeah.
How you move from one stage to another? How do you ground your vision of change from I want things to change to I want things to change to a better and more deeply, what I say, spiritual and cultural way. The way of knowing, the way of thinking, the way of producing something different. If it's transformational, it has to come from something different than what the racism that we're fighting came from. In other words, you can't solve the problem and you can't create transformation out of the same thing that produced the kind of strategy and hatred that we are trying to transform. You have to have an alternative. So I think that's what my work has been about, that culture has to include spirituality. So it has to. It can't. If spirituality is not present, then culture is not present. So language and values and customs and beliefs that come from a spiritual ground is what we try to put in place. And we see it play out in the classrooms with the children that we work with. We see it play out particularly with African American children that we work with, where children are expressing a level of frustration and rage, and where does that come from at age 7, 10, and 12? And what we're really beginning to see is that it comes from the lack of capacity, again, to express what they are, what's going on inside. So if you think about what spiritual values are, they are more internal. So what we try to do is to say, tell us what's happening with whatever words you have, and that then will tell us what's happening in your spirit. And we try to really teach the children and work with children and show them that deeper levels of thinking and deeper levels of imagining something different will give them the capacity to once again transform any situation they're in. So as we teach cultural classes, so that means that we In the classroom, we expose children to, once again, those things that culture brings. So what does language bring? Having them think about their language, think about their people, and think about their family system, their community, and think it through and say, what is it that you get from this family? And in many cases, if it doesn't feel good to the children, then we say, what would you create if you had the opportunity?
Empower them.
What would you create? Right. What would be the alternative to that kind of sadness? And it's an amazing experience to watch the children come up with things that we think comes from the internal kind of process. And this work that we're doing is anti-racism work.
Uh-huh.
In other words, it is, it's the alternative
Countering.
to, yes,
Yeah.
it's the alternative to what currently exists, that we can't fight things and replace them unless you have something to put in their place. And so that's the approach that we're using at this point. We have practitioners and clinicians, and whether they're educators or, as I said, healthcare providers, who come here to relearn a way of living and being that does challenge the institutional practices that are racist and are judgmental. And so our
That are
approach
part
to
of the
it
structures.
is,
Yeah.
our approach to it is that people, individuals, this personal transformation has to start from the inside out. And no matter where we work and no matter what position we hold, we are a part of the problem. And now we must together become a part of the solution.